You know how sometimes there are questions you really want to ask, but you feel like you just can't go there? Well, today we're going to go there. Specifically, we're going to look at some questions about the editing process that people really ought to be asking, but aren't. Hi there, my name is Katie Morgan. I am an indie fantasy author and fiction editor, and welcome to Bardic Fool's Editing Advice for Writers, the series where we talk about the ins and outs of the editing process and getting feedback on your work. So working with a professional editor for the first time can be a little intimidating. You're not really sure what questions to ask because you don't really know what you don't know. This can be especially true when there are questions you need to be asking yourself. So for this video, I thought we could talk a little bit about some of the biggest questions that I think the writing and editing community really needs to be talking about that they aren't so much. Question number one, what kind of editing do I need, or do I need all of them? This is actually one of the most difficult questions that you need to ask because you need to be very, very honest with yourself about where you are in your writing journey. As you might remember from my video on the overall editing process, there are a lot of different kinds of editing, and so it's very helpful to know what kind you actually need. And you may not need every single kind of editing. However, this is the part where you have to get really honest about your current writing skills. Because yes, you can skip certain elements of the editing process, but there are potential consequences for doing that. For example, if you take a look at the one-star reviews on Amazon, you'll see a lot of commentary about editing mistakes, whether that's grammar and spelling, more mechanical stuff, or bigger picture, character, plot things that don't make sense. So editing really does matter, and if you skip one of those steps in the editing process, you are potentially opening yourself up for some of these really negative one-star reviews. And the kind of editing you need may be different project to project, so it's really important to get clear on not just your skill at the moment, but what this particular book might need. Question number two, what should I be looking for in an editor? This is actually a fairly commonly asked question, but I think there are more elements to the answer that are not always discussed. So the big ones, of course, are things like, what is their experience? What are their qualifications? Do they read in your genre? And maybe most importantly, do they offer the kind of editing that you need? But I think you need to go a little bit more in depth with the answers to these questions. For example, let's talk about qualifications. So it is very possible for someone to get a certificate or even a degree in editing. And if someone has that, that can be really useful information for writers because it shows you that someone has gone to the effort to get the training that they need to treat this in a professional manner. That said, there are perfectly decent editors out there who do not have a certificate or do not have a degree, but they do have experience with editing books in your genre that have gone on to be published and successful. So it's not just a matter of do they have a 4.0 GPA, it's what actually are their qualifications and their experience, and is that relevant for what you need? I also think there are a couple of other elements to this question that are not often discussed. For example, if you're looking at an editor's copy on their own website or social media, are you seeing a lot of errors? And I don't mean like a typo here and there, I mean consistent errors that show they are not taking the time and effort to present a really professional front. That's really important because the way an editor presents themselves professionally tells you a lot about how they're going to work with your manuscript. So if their copy is kind of messy, that doesn't really bode well for how much attention to detail they're going to bring to editing your piece. The other thing I think is really important in finding the right editor, which I don't think people really talk about too much, is basically the vibe or the intuition that you get around this person when you're looking at their website or their social media, or you're even talking to them in person. What kind of a feel do you get from them? Do they seem like someone who would be really interesting and fun to work with? Do they seem very knowledgeable? If you're getting kind of a negative vibe on that level, that may be a red flag that you shouldn't work with them. And now we're going to get into the money stuff that no one wants to talk about. Question number three, how much should I be paying? This is a really big one, and you'd think there would be an easy answer to it, but unfortunately there really isn't. This question actually made this list because there isn't really an easy answer to it. So the first thing I would suggest for this is to look at a rate chart. The most common one is from the Editorial Freelancers Association. I'll put a link down below. And that rate chart is updated regularly, and what that tells you is the median range that editors are charging for various kinds of editing. Of course, because they're median rates, that means some people are charging less and some people are charging more, but it gives you a little bit of a sense of what the going rate is for different kinds of editing. And rates are useful, but they're also kind of complicated because someone who charges more is not necessarily a better editor than someone who charges less. and someone who charges less is not necessarily a worse editor than someone who charges more. What is true is that an editor who charges more probably has more experience, and that might be relevant to you if you are newer to the publishing process and need a little bit more guidance through the editing portion. On the other hand, working with a newer editor can actually be really good because not only are you getting that lower rate, so you're paying less, you're also creating this relationship at a very early stage in this person's career, and so you're kind of getting in on the ground floor, and you can potentially have this relationship for a really long time. So I would say try not to spend more than you really feel comfortable spending, but keep in mind that whatever time and money you're putting into the editing process now is an investment in your future. Question number 4, do I have to pay at all? So despite what you might have heard in some writing communities, if you want a professional level edit, you are almost certainly going to have to pay a professional. There's just no way to get that level of edit from spell check. That said, some of the earlier levels of the feedback process, like alpha readers or beta readers or critique partners, are generally available for free, although paid beta readers are a thing, and I actually already did a video on that and I'll link it below. But generally speaking, there's a lot you can do in terms of editing and feedback before you send your project to a professional editor, and that can kind of help with the financial element. And question number 5, why are there no prices listed on this editor's website? How am I supposed to budget? So there are 2 sides to this question. Let's start with the editor side. Many editors choose not to put the specific prices on their website because it tends to deter people who are only in it for the cheapest price and don't necessarily care about the quality of the work. What you'll often see instead of specific prices is the opportunity to contact the editor and talk a little bit more about your specific project, and that can be really helpful to see if you're a good fit, and also to determine what your price is based on your specific project rather than some sort of general notion. Basically, it's a way to make sure that the communication is clear in terms of what the editor is offering and what the writer needs. However, from a writer's perspective, this tactic can be incredibly annoying because if you don't know someone's prices up front, then you could be spending a lot of time having these conversations with an editor who is not a very good fit for you in terms of your budget. So one way that editors get around this, and this is something that I do as well, is to list on their website some sort of starting rate. This gives the writer an idea of what they might want to budget, but it's not specific until you can actually have that conversation between the writer and the editor and determine what's actually needed. And then there's a discussion of what the final price would be. So yeah, nailing down cost can be kind of tricky. I think the best way to handle this is to just really do your best to have open and honest communication between the editor and the writer to make sure you find a good fit. So those are the top 5 questions I think the writing and editing community needs to be talking about more than they are, but what do you think? And what are some of your unanswered questions? Feel free to leave them in the comments below so we can chat. And if you're interested in talking to an editor about your specific writing project, you can find more information about my editing services below. Or if you're in more of a reading mood today, I've got more information about my contemporary fantasy novel, Dark Empathy, also below. That's it for this episode of Bardic Fool's Editing Advice to Writers. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.